Agenda. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you want the microphone, please? Sorry.
I don't, but they might. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Chairman Thomas. I'll be conducting tonight. I'd like to welcome everybody to the North Ogden City Planning Commission meeting, September 7th, 2022. We'll begin our meeting with an invocation or a thought from Commissioner Webb, followed which being led by the Pledge of Allegiance by Commissioner Mason. We'll go to that point, Commissioner Webb.
Father in heaven, we're grateful to be here together as a city. We're grateful for the many blessings that we have. This beautiful place that we live in. Bless us tonight that we ask that was bless us tonight to thoroughly understand one another and speak clearly and forward the things of each citizen and our wonderful city. And these things we say in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Please rise and repeat the Pledge of Allegiance with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We'll make note that Commissioner Mancaro and Watson are excused tonight.
Commissioner Watson texted me and said he is running late. He may be here.
Okay. Our minutes consideration and action to approve the July 6th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Any corrections or adjustments need to be made? Entertain a motion.
I'll make the motion to approve the planning commission meeting for July 6, 2022.
I'll second.
There a motion and a second to approve the minutes. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right, our opening meeting statement. Before each agenda item begins, city staff will give a report. After the staff report, the item will be open for other speakers. The applicant will speak first and be allowed up to 10 minutes. Following the applicant, any other interested person will be allowed to speak for up to 3 minutes. The applicant has final rebuttal time of up to 5 minutes. Any materials that are displayed or referenced, e.g. pictures or written materials, are part of the record and must be left with the commission. Speakers are required to have signed in at the door and will state their name and address before beginning their remarks. If you agree with the previous speaker, then state your agreement to avoid repetitious remarks. Speakers shall address the commission from the podium or microphone and shall address all comments to the planning commission. Please silence your phones. All right. Any ex parte or conflicts tonight? We'll open up for public comment at this time. If you would like to address the planning commission on something that's not on the agenda, again, we have 2 public hearings. You'll have time to address us on those items, but if it's something else, we invite you to step up to the podium and address us at this time. All right, Scott, we'll move on tonight. We only have legislative items. Item number 6 is Zone Text Amendment 2022-9. Is a public hearing, consideration, and recommendation on a legislative amendment to revise the retaining wall standards to add clarifying language in Title 11, grading and drainage standards. Presenter is Scott Hess, our planning director. Scott.
Thank you, members of Planning Commission. I'm actually going to do just a brief intro and then invite Eric Casperson, our city engineer, to get up and actually speak about this because he's the one that's by ordinance in the review position for retaining walls. And then also would like to use the public hearing tonight to discuss another item that wasn't, it was sort of on the radar, but it wasn't explicitly requested to be on the agenda yet. And that's total height of retaining walls. And so we'll get into that after we have the discussion about this life safety issue. What the ordinance change that you're looking at in front of you would add clarifying language about geotechnical reports or other engineering reports that would be required alongside retaining walls that would appear to have a higher than normal life safety risk. And this would be, say, a tall wall in close proximity to sleeping quarters of a house or near a basement foundation where there's going to be bedrooms or occupied space. And in those cases, in order to, in some ways, reduce liability for the city, but also just make sure that the property owners know what they're buying and understand the liability that they're buying, have additional engineering studies that say what would happen in a failure, or that there's these mitigating impacts that are these mitigating conditions that will reduce the chance of failure. Just because it's something that happens not in all lots, but when you have a city on a hill like we have, there are some homes that are tucked into either the corner of or kind of like a U-shaped multi-tiered retaining wall that in a full failure situation would create potential for catastrophic failure or life loss. So with that kind of brief introduction, it's okay with my permission, I invite Eric Casperson, city engineer, to come up and address us on anything else in that particular portion of the ordinance.
Okay, Eric?
Thanks, Planning Commission. I've been here for 6 months here with the city, and I think this is the first time I've ever been here in Planning Commission and addressing you. So
We've learned a lot of things on you, so.
yeah, well, that's okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity. As in my short time here, I have seen quite a few retaining walls that have primarily the rockeries, is what they call them, the rock walls that are stacked rocks. A lot of questions have come up on if this wall were to fail, what would happen? And so it kind of came up, this question of what other type of studies can we do to help homeowners and the city make better decisions on these walls, and how do we determine these? Right now, our rockery or rock wall height is 6 feet maximum, and so and that is pretty standard for other cities within our area. Right now, the reinforced concrete walls are 8 feet max height, and that's pretty standard for cities in our areas as well. I'm not sure if there's any questions that you would have.
There have to be non-conforming
There are.
walls out there because
Hundreds. Well, but remember, this has only been in place for
okay.
2 years, if you remember when we put it.
So,
Yes.
think about Weaver High, and then street above Weaver High, my parents live there actually, and the neighbors have 20-foot rock walls. What's the solution for those people? Is it to terrace them? A rockery is 6 feet and a terrace and then 6 foot.
Yes,
So it's not the total from bottom to top. It's
correct.
It's in any particular patch. Okay.
Right, correct. Yeah, and the terrace, the code specifies that the terrace must meet the horizontal distance of the tallest wall. So in this case, it'd be 6 feet. And that's measured from the front of the bottom wall to the front of the upper wall. And so that's how that's measured.
What about there's a home up corner of North Line Divide on the left-hand side? That's just decorated stuff stacked with more than 20 feet.
Yeah.
Just over the top of the house. I know he had that specially engineered to be able to handle it, but would that still be allowed? I mean, he went through a lot of work for engineering on that.
Any wall at all that's over 4 feet has to have engineering in it. So yes, it would be required for engineering, but this would kind of brought up the question is walls that large, what would it do if it were to fail? What damage would it?
Would you like to ask my parents? I can show pictures.
And Scott, to answer your specific question about that particular wall is, in the current ordinance, no, you wouldn't be able to do that again. So the wall up there in Mason Cove, and there's 2 of them, that one that's 20+ feet, then another that's about 17, made of an engineered block that's ready rock is one term for it, or one product. And those would be 8 feet exposed is the maximum you could have. And again, you could do an 8-foot wall, an 8-foot separation, an 8-foot wall. with a limitation in the number of tiers that we have to 3. So you can eat up some of that, create a flat yard, but you're not gonna get as flat a yard as you did in the old Mason Cove under the old standard, because you used to be able to go out as far as you could and then just drop a taller wall.
Right. That'd be pretty tough, because that house is, you could never terrace it that way and still build a house.
Yeah, and
And
this,
every time I look at it, oh my heck, I talked to him, I know him, so he did a lot of engineering stuff on that to get it so to hold. I don't know how much he paid the engineers come in and designed it.
and that'll be part of, there's a public hearing associated with this, so a planning commission should hold a public hearing, but we can also discuss retaining wall heights now if you'd like to, or we can do it after the public hearing, whichever way you'd like.
I think we have the public hearing. Does anybody have any questions for the engineer prior to?
Well, I think it doesn't become very difficult to define terracing. So I mean, how many feet in does it have to go to be considered a terrace? Because these rockeries, as you call them, you can have a boulder and then, a boulder and then a boulder.
Well,
Right.
it has to equal a 1-to-1. So if you go 6 feet tall, the next set of rocks needs to be back 6 feet from where you started the
I
first
see.
row.
Okay,
So at the end of the day,
wow,
it's a 1-to-1 slope.
I see.
So in theory, if somebody puts their rocks at a 1-to-1 slope from bottom to top, is that not considered a wall anymore? Like without a terrace,
Without,
like if they just laid them. I
at
mean,
a 1-to-1.
yeah, in theory, that's what I wonder.
Yeah, I believe it's because it would be more of an erosion control in that case, right?
Yeah, so
Anything steeper than that.
Anything steeper than 1-to-1, it has to still, okay.
And the terracing, you won't see 6 feet of separation here. This is what Eric was saying, so you'll have these rocks and typically they bury the foot of this one in the dirt, one foot of this in the dirt. So you've got a 6-foot tall rockery, and the distance from the toe of this lower one to the toe of the upper wall needs to be at least a 6-foot width if that's a 6-foot height, and that's the same.
That graphic's super helpful.
Yeah, this is the same if it were an engineered concrete wall, and this is backfilled, then you could have the same situation, but then you'd have the distance here actually does mimic the height less the width of the wall.
Right, in that case, it'd be 8 feet.
So what's your opinion on the concrete or engineered wall like that to keep that same distance? I've had some people ask me about that and say, well, if it's engineered, you can engineer a wall 20 feet tall and hold just fine. Why do we have to put a terrace?
Yeah.
So from the safety side of it, that isn't really null and void. So the reasoning behind it then is, I guess the same thing, saying, would we allow that distance to be shorter on an engineered wall? If it's engineered to have a 4-foot terrace, it still has to have a terrace, but say, hey, we'll allow a 4-foot terrace if it's engineered in. Because then, as you know, the engineer, that bottom wall now has to be engineered as though it's one continuous wall. 'Cause
Right.
it's shorter than, so there's a lot more strength in it on an 8-foot wall that normally would be required because it's technically accounting for the wall above it.
Correct, yeah.
But if somebody wants to pay for that, say, well, I want a terrace to plant something, but I don't want to lose 24 feet of wall by the time I stack it all up.
And that
24 feet of-
comes to the discussion on retaining wall heights. So we have a current retaining wall in the city that's been recently constructed that they're gonna have a difficult time meeting their 8-foot exposed. They're more like, call it 11 feet or so. So they need to bury 3 feet of wall. But that requires potentially either grading onto a neighboring property owner's property or coming up with some like sub-terrace idea or rocks or something. So the request from the homeowner is, can we revisit the total wall height standard? Because he would likely, I wasn't here 2 years ago when this went in, but it's mostly an aesthetic standard. And you, like you just said, you can engineer a really tall wall. UDOT does it all the time. If you're willing to pay for it, you can have a really tall sheer wall. But it comes down to what does the city want? What limits impacts on neighboring property owners? What limits impacts on a hillside city with visibility issues of these very large walls, which can be they can stick out. I mean, you go from a former hillside to all of a sudden you have this big blank wall. And that's a discussion item for the planning commission, and we're not prepared with other cities or information other than, I think 8 feet in looking around is pretty common for other cities surrounding us. So we're not overly restrictive. But there's, if the city decides that they want something different for their wall standard, we could certainly review that.
Okay, well, we can talk about that in the discussion part. But, I'll bring that up when we talk about it. Any other questions? Thanks, Eric.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go ahead and open the public hearing on Zone Text Amendment 2022-9, amending some clarifying language in Title 11 of the grading and drainage standards as it relates to the retaining walls. Public hearing is now open. If you'd like to address us, please step up to the mic, state your name and address. We'd love to hear from you.
Short, sorry, I don't name it down. Anyways, Chris Bolger, I live up in 3739 North, 575 East. And as Scott was saying, I live below the house that has that retaining wall that we're talking about. But to stick with the agenda, I agree with what Eric and Scott were saying about adding that in. I would also say something. I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I think amending some of the other stuff inside that drainage and standard, especially the retaining wall part, I think would be effective to have some type of I don't know if you want to call it survey of the people that are directly impacted by that wall, if it does violate the 8-foot wall rule. But just as a side note, I did note that the measurement of height is technically the finished grade below the wall and then finished grade above the wall. So if you have a 12-foot wall, but he's only got the finished grade with grass on it 4 feet below it, that technically still meets the requirement. So I don't know if that's the intent, but that would be technically allowed. So and that's in H number 1. Anyway, so did we want to go any further than that?
I have some questions for you. As someone who lives close to one of these, and I do too. And let me frame this by, as Scott was presenting this, I was having a hard time understanding why this is such an aesthetic issue. Because, you know, I generally view these things from far away. I'm assuming you live close to one of these.
I live right next to it.
Can you comment on the aesthetics and the impact? That?
The aesthetics myself, I have been wanting this wall since he mentioned that he was going to do a brick wall, because I've been in how many different houses in the North Ogden area and other places where the rock wall, the natural rock wall that he's talking about, has either failed, or I've had ground squirrels or vines that I can't get rid of. Just a myriad of different cons that I just, but to answer your question directly, I love the wall. And I said, build it as high as you want. I have a shed right next to it that I thought it'll look weird, but to be honest, the shed's there. I have natural oak trees that basically block, I'd say, I don't know what you say, Scott, but I'd say 50% of it. And then the next door neighbor, basically she has stuff that's cemented in the ground and she doesn't want to grade. So when she's like, put some bushes up, I'm good. So, you know, from the aesthetic pleasing point of it, it retains things that I don't want deer and wind and everything else breaking my trees. I thought I'd be, you know, so to me, from that standpoint, yes, it's aesthetics. I already have plans for Christmas lights on the wall. The homeowner that built it, let's go.
So how high is this wall?
From my current grade, where I want to keep it if possible, it's 11 to 12, I think, is based on the peak height and the peak valley that I have underneath it.
So do you think there'd be a point at which it become offensively large?
Yeah, I mean, for honestly, there's a one that's just down the street on the new side where there's no trees or nothing. And to be honest, they kind of just rolled some rocks up onto it to make it look shorter. But I mean, there's nothing in front of it. It's just a stark. So if you have nothing there, nothing blocking it, no little cool pine trees or something, yeah, I think it's aesthetically stark and naked. You're in an industrial park at that point. But if it blends in with the nature, to me, you know, my lot from the north end to the south end drops 40 feet. You have to have a retaining wall. So there's no way to get around it, or you're mowing up a 45-degree inclination. You know, it just doesn't work. So retaining walls at a certain height, 8 feet plus, you're gonna see it as you go into the cove. I mean, I'm sure they're already there, but
Oh, they're-
I'm sure I'm faster in a few minutes, but
Well, thank you.
yeah, thanks.
Do we have anybody online?
We do have one person, but their hand isn't raised.
I'll make a motion that we close the public hearing.
I'll second it.
We have a motion, a second to close the public hearing. All in favor? Any opposed? Public hearing is now closed. We'll move into our discussion, consideration and recommendation portion of this item. Thoughts? Discussion? I mean, what I started to talk about in the concrete side of it is if it's an engineered wall or as concrete structure or even these keystone ready wall rock blocks, I don't mind, I guess, to help the situations where you may have lots that are so steep that by the time, like, we've ran into some situations where the lots have already been designed, improved up there in one of my subdivisions. When we passed this, I said, you know, there's situations where by the time you step these rock walls back so far, you're going to be at the back door of the house.
Yeah.
And that's why the provision went in back then of, at the engineer's discretion, you can go higher or make some adjustments. So that was kind of a way to around some of these existing lot conditions to where going forward as developers, we hope all of them understand this and make the lots, if they're steep, they got to make them a little bit deeper so there's room to accommodate something like this. But my opinion on the concrete side of it is if it's engineered properly, and when I say that is allowing a reduction between that 8 foot of top wall, the bottom of the next tier. So, you know, it would have to be engineered to where it, you know, it's like one, if they engineer a 16-foot tall wall as one, if you understand that bottom wall might be 12 inches thick with a double mat of rebar.
Yeah.
And then you, even though it's only 8 feet tall, because you're going to space and reduce that reduction to maybe 4 feet, as long as there is, I would say, you know, we put some kind of requirement in there that something, a vertical vegetation, you know, be planted in that. So when you look at that wall and it's stepped, you see something that's breaking it. And now that's kind of weird language to require, but
No, I think it makes sense.
you're moving a little closer. So then it's like, because truthfully, you say you got 3 tiers and you're now really 8 feet because you've used vertical construction material. That becomes kind of a, you know, I mean, it's big enough, you might be able to do a garden in there, but honestly, if it's south facing, it'll just get bake in that.
Yeah.
Against the walls. So landscaping wise, then people say, well, there's xeriscape between it. Well, then that doesn't accomplish the aesthetics looks of it. So if we had some language in there, it says some type of vertical vegetation or something. So when you look at the wall from the aesthetic side of it, you see that break line. And then that would allow people only in certain situations to have it. You know, you could reduce as much as 8 feet on a 3 foot, on a 3-tier wall of space if it was limited. And that's all down to engineering. So the structure of it would be fine. You know, it's engineered that way. And then
So-
we're also accomplishing the,
So
The
counterpoint,
tiers.
and I think I agree with you, by the way, but you know, we had our one testimonial here that said, I gotta collect my thoughts here. What was I gonna say? Oh, what was I trying to say? I got halfway into this.
like
thought.
if you wanted one wall taller than 8 feet and the neighbor
that's not
doesn't
what I
care
was gonna say.
and he encourages it. Yeah, I want one 12-foot wall.
Well, my concern was that we encourage vegetation to grow. And then it's planted that way, and then the vegetation dies, you know, whatever, it's gonna bake, because I agree, that close to stone, your roots are gonna bake and things like that. And then what's gonna grow out of there is weeds, and that's where I was going. His testimonial was that he didn't like the rocks because they're a hotbed for weeds. Well, are we just legislating then a hotbed for weeds? You know what I mean, like fertile ground.
Yeah,
just
that's
for-
the hard thing. I know. I think of that Keystone Wall at Mason Cove, the 20+ foot one that the house sits on. How much different would that look if it had even just a row of, when you looked at it, the wall looked still 20 feet tall, but every 8 feet there was a row of some kind of vegetation. All of a sudden it would dramatically look different. But
Even if it were.
that's the question. Does it matter? Like, are we legislating ugly or
Right.
beauty? You know, some people might say 20-foot wall looks better than a 20-foot tree. I don't know.
The
I don't
problem-
know if it's bad to be encouraged beauty.
No, I don't disagree. It was fun. I'm thinking here, that big tall wall like that, be terraced a little bit. Maintaining those terraces would be really difficult.
Yeah,
I'd find a way to get something down around there to keep it nice looking. Like the guy who has that one up there right now is helping out that great. There's no way he's gonna get down there and take care of it. This is really gonna be. So I don't know, the answer's not real easy.
no, that's just, I mean, I only throw that out there of saying, in certain situations, somebody says, hey, I don't have space to terrace this. I'm spending the money to do a concrete wall because I don't have the space between the house or whatever to do it. And so is that a caveat to reduce that requirement?
Cause you get up on those hillside, that's gonna be more and more common. You know, unless like you said, they're required to make a lot steeper, allow for the terracing of the wall.
But that, I mean, just as far as concrete, and it's not the house that we're talking about. There's another one up there, unless it is yours on the side? Like there's one I'm thinking of that's right behind the house. And it's like a 12-foot concrete wall that goes up.
Yeah, that's over in
In Mason
Mountain
Cove.
Stone Crest. Well, there's a Mason Cove, but there's one in,
It's west, I think, west of you.
Yeah, it's actually the road above, just as you go, west.
And that one, you know, is the one I think of, like, you know, it's kind of one of those.
You didn't even finish it.
If I was living in the house below and somebody put that there, it'd be like, oh, man. But at the same time, you know, that's in and somebody buys the house below and the wall's already there. It's like, well, you know what you're
Sure.
getting, but is it something that we, you know, because one side of me says, well, as long as I don't care about beauty, as long as these life safety factors covered from engineering, why does it matter? You know, from one standpoint, you say, well, if you've got 15 feet of elevation drop on your yard and you're going to pay all this money to build a wall to get it flat, is it that critical? Like, are we in the business of saying, well, no, you can't block it. Your neighbor has to be able to look into your basement windows, not your upstairs windows, you know, that lives below you.
Yeah, I agree with you, but you know, there's gonna be people that, they're gonna own the house.
Because then it goes back to the same
And
thing. You build it, if it's 20 feet tall, it's gotta be 20 feet away from property line, you know, like we do on the accessory buildings.
Yeah.
And so it's,
I keep thinking those homes up in Mason Cove, they, you know, some of them, the home itself is like a giant retaining wall, right? The home's coming down into a walkout basement, or even not a non-walkout basement. It's 2 stories below the main level, because the you know, the property was graded that way, or just that steep. So what's the difference between the walls of the house and the retaining wall? I'm
I
not
would
seeing.
say some of the houses sit on the retaining wall.
well, and hopefully the idea with having an ordinance like this is when those subdivisions on steep areas like that get developed, they're not just 12,000-foot lots crammed in there because the engineer who drew it looked good on flat ground. And then you put it on slope and said, oh, this doesn't work. You know, that thought has to go into it. That one was done beforehand. And, you know, I mean, truthfully, you look at that, there shouldn't be 2 lots between the top road and the bottom road. It should be 1. So there's the space to do this. Brandon,
One.
you step up to the mic, please.
You want your name, address, or anything, social security number, bank account number.
You know, one difference, between a home and a retaining wall is that, with the home, people living in it have a much higher incentive to make it look attractive versus the retaining wall, because it's not integral to their structure and their dwelling, and there's not that same pride of ownership. But also because they don't look at it. If it's a retaining wall on their property, they're not the one that has to look at it, the neighbor does. And so there's a much lower incentive to make it attractive compared to homes. Thought that just occurred to me. So.
Yeah, so that's if it's an aesthetic thing that we're trying to govern, then we figure out how to do that. Because I agree, it's,
Well, I don't think aesthetics should be our main priority, but I do think it needs some consideration, because I can just see the day when we're sitting here and it's not on the agenda and someone comes and they ask for time. And, you know, and I feel bad that they got to this point, but they're so upset that their neighbor's building this giant brick wall. And they're gonna have to look at this wall instead of the mountain that they used to look at. And I know it's not on their property, I know all that, but I mean, I think we do need to respect that interest a little bit. You know, it's the same as when we get people coming here and say, oh, my neighbor's building a barn and I hate it. Then I can think of the neighborhood that's been in here, right? It's the same thing. It's a giant piece of metal that I have to look at now. And you know, we respected that aesthetics. So I don't
The
think
hard
it's
thing is
anything.
it goes back to, like, obviously being a builder and developer, how many times I hear people say, well, I don't want a house right there. I've lived here and looked at that field for how long, and
Certainly.
now a house is gonna block my view. And I always say, well, you can buy the lot before somebody builds on the house, builds a house on it, if you want to protect that view,
Certainly.
you know, and to some extent, you know, it's not necessarily the city's responsibility to make sure everybody has a wonderful view out of their property, you know, onto other people, you know, saying, hey, I live on this lot and now there's a house there and blocks my view of Ben Lomond. City, why did you approve that subdivision?
Completely agree with you.
But so how do we govern that? And that's where it comes down to, you know, the aesthetics and height, Scott.
And right now, we really don't regulate aesthetics of these things. It's just 8 foot is the height that engineered, and Mr. Pulver had indicated this lot to the west of this subdivision. It's Northview Estates is where this
Yes,
other
yeah.
subdivision is. Has what appears to be an unfinished wall, but we don't have a definition of what a finished wall is. So this is a reinforced concrete wall where they removed the forming off of it and knocked the metal ties that tie the foundation forms, and it's just a concrete wall. And so they didn't stucco it, they didn't clad it in anything, it just is raw concrete. And we don't have a term of finished versus unfinished, but that wall would likely look better stuccoed or clad to match the house in some way, or had
Christmas
some,
lights.
you know, Christmas lights. Brandon Bell suggested that you have to paint the scenery that you're blocking on the wall. But up with the, you know, up speaking with property owner this wall, there were some suggestions that were knocked around, and maybe one of them is exceptions to go higher if you do like the +1 aesthetics treatment to it. You tier it in a way that you can plant vertical evergreen hedges. I know that it gives, I'm not an engineer, but it gives me pause to think about watering on top of some of those terraced walls, just because the last thing you really want is water infiltration behind a retaining wall.
Yeah.
But it would be providing some sort of exterior finishing, but then again, you're legislating ugly, because what some people might think of, I'm going to build a modern house and I'm going to clad this thing in a way that I'm going to put plywood on the inside of my form. So when I put it south, it's imprinted with plywood. Like, to them, that might be the best thing ever. Like, they just finished their concrete wall with something else. They might think it looks unfinished, and so I want to figure out if there's a way to say, yes, this is the right standard for the city, or a taller wall is the right standard for the city, without putting the staff in a position of having to, you know, subjectively decide what is or isn't meeting these ordinance requirements from an aesthetic standpoint.
Okay, so we've got two things here we're considering. One is the text amendment that you're proposing for this, right? Which I think I'm in favor of, doesn't it? It just adds additional engineering, right? I don't have any objection to that. The second thing is you've asked us to look at is height, right? That one seems a little more nebulous, but I don't know. I'd like, do we feel good about the text amendment that's in there? I do myself, and I don't see any reason why I wouldn't recommend that move on.
And to avoid posting another public hearing notice, and we can repost as a way to like notify on Facebook that we're still having this conversation, but it's in the same Title 11 grading and drainage standards where our wall heights and tiering and all of that those elements are. Staff's recommendation at this point would be to postpone a decision on this ordinance and roll it all together and bring it all together, because there's nothing pressing about this particular ordinance. This is a hopeful catch for the next one of these that we have, where you get a rockery that's built around, and surrounds a house. But the height one is a bit more of a, we've had a request, and so we want to jump on that. I don't want it to get delayed or bumped a meeting because of reposting requirements.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'm following you, so.
So you're
so
saying-
what, at what point I heard you,
If we postpone this item, we can just roll our additional elements into this item and come back to you in 2 weeks with a staff.
and that way it
report.
goes once to the city council.
Yep.
I'd be
So,
in favor of taking
I
it.
think that works well. I would just say while you're looking at that, maybe, because I know in the ordinance, it still gives the city engineer the ability to make exceptions or judgments on, and maybe it is just including in there some parameters, so there's some expectation. So it's not on Eric's shoulders that if he comes back and says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll allow you to come have a 4-foot spacing. If you engineer that wall as one continuous wall, I'll reduce your tiers to 4 feet on a concrete wall. And then, it's like he just made that up or something, but if there's some kind of language in there, at least that's saying these are some options for variances upon the cities with the city engineer's approval, then there's at least some level of expectation. So it's not necessarily all on his shoulders that people will be mad or thankful that he decided, or you let this guy do that, why can't I, somewhere that, because I don't like when we have just saying, oh, it's up to the engineer, like there can be under certain circumstances, based on the engineer's approval, you can do pretty much anything you want, right? Based on what the engineer is going to approve. If there's at least some parameters of the level of expectation that somebody goes in and says, well, if I want a variance from this from the engineer, I'm going to be expected to put twice as much effort into this wall. But there is a way to maybe not do it the standard. So at least there's some level of expectation, Eric.
Yes, exactly. And that's what's kind of come up. That's what brought this up. Is there are walls out there that I've looked at that exceed the 6 foot and violate the terracing ordinance. But so it had a caveat. There was additional engineering, but it didn't say what it was. And so that's what I wanted to add this to give some clarification on what we could require, because this is a pretty extensive ask.
Yeah, and I would prefer it be, any additional engineering or whatever that you recommend, to say, well, do this, that's gonna fall on an outside engineer that's stamping this, and it's
Yes.
not your, oh, if you do it this way, it's okay. If you do it this way and an engineer stamps it, I'll accept it.
Correct.
So that we don't have the city's liability, or it's your, well, I'll let you do this if this, it's like, well, if you switch to 4 feet and do all these things, some engineer has to sign off on it and stamp it and say that's acceptable, but I'm willing to accept that if you get it. So that way it's not on you.
Yeah.
Or the
Yes.
city.
The only caveat I would add to that is that we do have engineers who don't always look at the things they stamp. Obviously not Eric.
Yeah,
And then the other thing we've seen is we've run into situations where there's so many situations.
well, but I
Things
think,
aren't built the way they're engineered, so the engineer changes their plans. Like honestly, the 8-foot engineered system is much more comfortable than the other, because what we end up with as an engineer says, oh yeah, no, that'll hold. Yeah,
Yeah.
8 feet rocks, those will hold.
Well, it's also not precisely measured, right? They just put those rocks in there with a backhoe and it's as good as the guy who put it in there.
And then
Right.
most of we've seen one where the engineer included so many caveats that no one would ever be able to go after their insurance if the wall failed. So they said,
Again, talk to my parents.
this wall needs to be inspected monthly. We're not gonna basically anything that you didn't do that was on the list of things, like if you see any shifting, you need to call us immediately so we can re-engineer, and there's zero liability as soon as that, so as soon as that first month goes by.
well, and I think that it's important that we put, if it is outside engineer, it's not just because an outside engineer stamps something, then Eric and city accepts it. Yeah, that's a requirement, but it's still up to the city whether they're willing to accept that or not. And so then that way it's not, I know some walls that's that way. We'll go get an engineer now that it's already built, and yeah, you go get, I know a couple of them. You can go get them, sign it, stamp it. Yeah, those things aren't going to move, and most likely they're not. I mean, especially a lot of places up there. I mean, I've had a vertical wall up there on the hill for 2 years and it hasn't moved. It hasn't have anything by it.
Talk to my parents.
Now, so, I mean, ultimately, it's the underground, the underlying soil, it's what it's gonna do.
Yeah.
And so,
And you also never know until
Yeah.
people start adding water to the top.
That's what-
Yeah.
That's what my dad did.
And so that's why my point is that the engineered walls, I mean, that if it's concrete or this engineered block, I mean, they're typically backfilling with gravel and drains and stuff. And a lot of these rockery walls don't have that, or it's not installed to the same level of expertise because they're cheap. Some people think they're better looking, so there's like all
so,
these.
yeah, so when
trade-offs.
something like that, we say, we're not gonna bend on a boulder wall and reduce the terracing and all that, even if an engineer signs off, because of that exact reason. It's a lot easier to govern and inspect a horizontal concrete or keystone wall to make sure it's built per spec than
Yeah.
a boulder wall.
Right, and we talked about even saying in certain areas of a lot where if it collapses, it's not gonna hit a neighboring structure or the house that, that it's there to retain from. Then maybe those can be taller, because the
Yeah.
failure isn't a life
Yeah.
issue, like the one next to your parents, it didn't go into anybody's
Not
house.
next to, in their backyard.
Yeah. But it just went down the hill, right?
Yeah.
And so there wasn't a risk of life and death,
Or it's gonna collapse and fall out into the street.
yeah.
And
But there's one house that I think, Scott, you said, where it's seriously surrounded by rock walls, and if they collapse, they're going into the basement windows.
Yes, and all the living in the second, or I guess the ground floor bedrooms as well. Yeah, and it's actually just west of your home that you're building there.
Yeah, I know
the
the one.
wall.
I
So,
I watched the guy build it and I'm like, well,
And that's why we thought, well, maybe that's a situation where you could go taller, is there's no risk. Because it's not in the path of anything if something collapses. But it's a lot of,
yeah, if you're saying, hey,
That's hard to.
if there's no
Yeah,
living
yeah.
space within a 2-to-1 slope from the wall, you're allowed to a little bit of higher, so you're allowing some fallout, but that's, again, any of these have to be provisions that would be.
And then just because the rocks themselves don't fall into anything, doesn't mean the structures above it are then stable. So my parents, they had a 30-foot rock wall. They built out a boulder wall like this. It was there for about 10 years. My dad had put all the downspouts into one common spot in the backyard. And I think that's what it rained for 4 days, one September. And in the middle of the night, my parents' house started shaking and their backyard just sloughed downwards. But so it didn't hit anything and there was nothing to hit. But they had to do a lot of stress about, is the house still stable, right? Because now their backyard is 20-30 feet less and closer to the house. So I don't think that's anything we could really look at is, because it doesn't hit anything, you're still changing, if it falls, changing things upstream from it as well.
The engineered walls have a lot of advantages, drains, all that kind of stuff, but also those rockeries, if they're not in their backyard, people just let weeds go in them. Whereas the engineered wall, it's a lot less likely to have weeds there.
True.
there's not a perfect answer, so.
Well, does that give enough direction because I'm inclined to table this for the purposes of, having the public hearing, having the public know that we want to talk about rock wall height. Okay, does that give you enough direction to come back with something?
Yeah, I think we'll look at other cities' ordinances and we'll do what we've done in the past with something like a sign ordinance or anything else that there isn't one right answer for. And produce a handful of different ordinances, and this is we'll have staff recommendation.
And I'm not opposed to, like gentleman here has said, he's fine with 12-foot wall that he likes it. I'm not opposed if that's one of the variances to do a vertical engineered wall, is if anybody within a certain touching it or whatever property all says, yeah, that's fine, and accepts it. Now granted, they move and the next person might not like it, but we can't control that, because I'm not opposed to,
Well,
if somebody says, I'm fine with that, that actually, I would rather have that than a terrace
I
retaining wall
hate
there.
that legislation like that because, I'm interested in keeping good neighbors. So your neighbor comes and knocks on your door and says, hey, I want to build this, this wall. And your wife hates it and you kind of hate it. And then again, you got to look at this guy in the face and see him every day, maybe for the next 20 years. And so you're probably going to be more inclined to say, yeah, I'm okay with that, and when you're really not. And so I just don't know if that really, I'd just rather see good legislation rather than something like that. I don't know what that looks like though. I don't know how to write that.
I think that's an oxymoron there. Good legislation.
Well, yeah, but I think you understand the situation I'm posing.
I do.
I've
We
signed
actually talked-
petitions, but I
We
don't have
actually
the-
talked about that with fences and
Yeah,
on top of retaining wall.
yeah. I mean, you're gonna do a lot of things because someone's standing on, looking you in the face, you can see, yeah. And then you're gonna go get an ulcer because you stress about it so much. Well,
Close the public hearing as well.
We
we
did.
did close the public hearing. Yeah, that was a motion by,
I made the motion.
seconded by Commissioner Barker. I would move that we table this item for the next meeting. Not the next meeting, excuse me, for a future meeting when we can have legislation.
Addressing that. Okay, we have a motion, a second, a table for future meeting when additional items can be addressed. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
I would encourage the gentleman who gave us public comment too, that your comments were recorded and they can be referenced at our next meeting, or you're welcome to attend as well. Okay. So I just don't want you to think you was all for naught tonight.
All right, item number 7, Zone Text Amendment 2022-10. This is a public hearing and consideration recommendation on a legislative amendment to update the public works standards adopted by ordinance and reference to North Oregon City Code zoning code title 11. Scott Hess. Scott?
Okay, so again, I'm gonna do a brief introduction and then ask Eric to help us present this one. A few years ago, the state legislature changed the requirements for cities on public works standards specifically to have them be adopted by ordinance. So while this isn't something that's specifically in the Title 11 zoning code, these public works standards filter down through all of our subdivision requirements and other site plan requirements for all manner of things, to include road right-of-way widths, road widths, sidewalk widths, park strips, street light requirement, and then all of your underground utilities are all specified in the public works standards. Yeah, just as an aside, in the past, you had some of these public works standards that would be changed administratively based on whatever city code they were in. And I think there was some pushback at the state legislature there of these kind of ever-changing standards. So the requirement now is that these are adopted by ordinance. And because they impact Title 11, we use this process to hold a public hearing and hear the updates on the public hearing standard, or the public works standards, and then roll them forward to city council, who ultimately adopts them, even though not everything in here impacts or affects our zoning and Title 11 code. So with that, these standards here are some clarification. Actually, Eric provided me with the language in the staff report that we have right-of-way widths for minor roads, residential minor roads, and for major arterials. We have an approved materials sheet on the first sheet of each utility. I think one of the things we tried to do there was take out proprietary named items. So it's not like we have to buy Joe's light. We can buy a light that matches this standard. And so I think that's a little easier for people when they go through, and they might use a different vendor than we typically use, but if it meets the standard, then that works. We also don't want to get into proprietary, like we're stuck in one specific type of underground utility pipe or connection or manhole or whatever else. We have some changes to the low impact design standards, clarifying what state requirements are. We do have one mismatch now, so site triangle standards in the public works standards have been changed, and I'll draw what the change is. And we'll be bringing back Title 11 in the fencing standards specifically is where it is called out, but the site triangle changes happen, and when Eric's presenting, I'll indicate that. And otherwise, nothing that's really groundbreaking. These are just kind of some rolling changes that Lauren was working on that Eric's now picked up and had a chance to review, and we need to get rolled in and updated so that everybody's looking at the same sheet when we're doing these new developments. Eric?
Thanks very much. Yeah, so as time change and new developments, new products come online, like to try to stay up to date, keep our standards and processes so that we are current. these standards are the Bible, right? That we hold the developers and everything to. And from my point of view, what I look at is North Ogden City and what's the best for them, for the city itself. We're gonna have to maintain this for the next 100 years plus, right? And so we're looking to do the best that we can and get the best product that we can. Scott referenced the LID requirements, and in connection with that, one of the major components of that, or to help with that, is the Mountain Road cross-section standardization on that. When I got here, it seemed like that Mountain Road, we weren't sure what we wanted it to be. And so
You're saying you've answered that question?
I'm not sure about that, but we put it on some sort of sheet. So that, I know one proposal was to put islands in the center of the kind of median islands in the center of the roadway. And so this cross section does not have that in it. It is just basically an 80-foot cross section with a 6-foot trail on the north and east side and bike lanes and 11-foot travel lanes. The site triangles that Scott mentioned is a 30-foot by 100-foot triangle. And I think you've kind of drawn it there.
So our current standard is a 40-foot, 40-foot, and it's out in the, it runs on property line. So it's more restrictive than I've drawn it actually, because called this the total right-of-way line. Your right-of-way line, no, this is right, but out here somewhere would be the curb and gutter that would run. And so that 40 feet ends up being more like 45, 49, something like that, depending on where you're at each direction. And that can be really impacting for people. So the new standard is a 30 by 100 from each direction. And then it's this area here. That's the clear view triangle that you'd have to have a reduced, an increased visibility fence that we talked about, or bushes that are trimmed to 24 inches or below, or over 7 feet per trees. So you'd have to keep that open area there as you come up to an intersection.
Right. So,
I thought we adopted those triangles already.
We have a triangle to this one though.
I remember doing that one with Lauren. I thought we already adopted it.
I think it's been in our public works standards. It just didn't ever make it to Title 11.
It's not in the code.
Yeah, it was never formalized through this process. It was something that we've let people adopt and use when they're doing commercial stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the first time it's actually in the standards. You have it in there.
So even letting people do it. Never mind.
So we adopted a standard that, what we really adopted was a rule change that said we can use UDOT standard on UDOT roads, which is where it's been affecting. Think of the Cherry Springs Village. Those retaining walls are much closer, but they match the picture on the left, not the picture on the right. And then we said we'd come back with a recommendation for all the rest of the residential, and this is that recommendation citywide. Yeah.
I do remember beating this up and going all over it, and I was very in favor of the new.
I'm glad to clarify that it's not in, again, citywide.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, one of the big things that we've added, and Scott mentioned about the different products, and on at the beginning of every utility sheet, for instance, the water, it was very cumbersome to have the names and everything within the standard sheet itself. So we've taken those out, we've separated it and made it into its own sheet, so that the contractors are able to see it much more clear. So and like Scott said, it's an equivalent, so he can, the contractor or developer can propose a different product as long as it meets the specs, and we consider it an equivalent.
So on that, have you written it in the way, like what I would hate to see for some things, like on water fitting, like fire hydrants? I'd hate the city to have 3 different kinds of spare parts, because we now have 3 different kinds of fire hydrants.
Right.
You know, if it's just, hey, we're using a Mueller hydrant, then that, you don't want to name that spec, but some places I think that's okay. Like
Yes.
we as a city don't want to have spare, you know, Watrous and Mueller and different hydrants in case somebody hits one. It's like,
Right.
we just want spare parts for one. Well, worst guys know how to fix one of them.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
is it
and-
still that way?
It
then?
is,
Oh,
yeah, and in that case, yeah, if we have Mueller, because yeah, you're exactly right, we don't want to have 10 different fire hydrants that we've got to go match that one with
yeah,
that specific brand. Yeah, so it's still written that way, and it still kind of leaves the door open for them to present maybe new ideas that, or maybe a new product that we haven't used before that maybe we'd like to try. It does leave the door open for that, but it ultimately lies with Public Works to make that determination.
okay.
So. That's all that I have. So.
Okay, any questions? Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's go ahead and open the public hearing for Zone Text Amendment 2022-10. Consideration and recommendation to update the public works standards adopted by ordinance in reference to North Ogden City Zoning Code Title 11. Public hearing is now open. If you'd like to address us, please step up to the mic and state your name and address.
To be the same thing that I've been dealing with some other times, but anyways, Chris Pulver, 3739 North, 575 East. So I guess the question I had is, because I was reviewing it and I forgot to look at, see if there was a variance to that. Because on hillside, because flat surface, agree 100%, gotta have, there's a couple of locations that I have to literally creep into the intersection to look past the fence. So I agree on a flat surface that 2 feet is almost too much sometimes. But on a angled corner, like I said, I have a 40-foot drop in my corner lot. If there is no provision to variance that, I do have pictures if you guys wanted to see that, but if there isn't, then I would propose to,
I'd be interested in seeing your pictures. You do have to leave them with us.
Yes.
You.
nope, I don't have a problem. Is that?
Yeah, just
absolutely.
pass
Okay.
it on.
I think I only have 3, so.
Yes, Chair.
So they stay with us and they
Yeah.
become part of the written record.
And so basically it was just, you know, because I had gone through, I don't remember who it was back in the day, when I created this and I kind of showed them pictures. I said, 2 feet, even if it's 40/40 or 30/100, I kind of just did a really quick and dirty. It looks like I spent a long time on it, but and I tried to take pictures from the height of a driver, this tall and whatever, looking out a window to try to see if there was any blockage from, so if you see that curved, I kind of blended it in, but it's 2 feet tall in that 30/30 or 40/40 thing. And doesn't block anything because of the height elevation of all of the different things in that. So I guess the question is that something in the future, a variance that, someone that's building that wall would have to or can enhance, because if they have to meet that, then, then all of a sudden I'd have a little goofy spot on that I'd have to kill my retaining wall to do that. So anyway.
I can answer that just from a practical standpoint, and the answer is no, just because we don't really have an out in the ordinance.
Okay.
If your wall is under 4 feet and it wasn't engineered and the city didn't review it, you're in a pretty low likelihood that the city will come in and say, knock on the door and say, property owner, you need to remove this from this particular area. And that's the same for vegetation in most cases. We're a pretty reactive code enforcement city where we don't have the staff to be driving around and proactively finding work to do. There's plenty that just seems to find its way to us.
Yeah.
So if you're building a fence, fences are done by land use permit. We'll have those reviewed each time. And we discussed this a lot. When you're on the coming up a hillside, 2 feet sometimes can be too tall. And when you're on the coming down a hill,
Right.
2 feet might not be enough height to allow somebody to grow a set of boxwood bushes or something. So it's a difficult issue to solve in clearly writing code for it. So I agree, but there's no how in the code right now. No.
Okay, but I mean, if someone really wanted to do it, they'd come here and get, I don't know, get approval, or how does that work?
So you could apply for a variance. You'd have to show how your lot is unique and you haven't essential property right pulled away from you. So variance law in Utah is really clearly specified by state code. You could come in if you were a property owner and do this process, which is suggest a zoning text amendment that might clarify that issue. To say if I'm a downhill lot on an X% of slope and I can show that I'm limiting impact, I can have something 4 feet tall. And that we've had specific case kind of zoning stuff written in, but we wait until someone brings those cases because there's just far too many individual, elements that we don't.
Yeah, and honestly, when you're writing your little thing, because I thought it was the whole 100 feet in that whole triangle you couldn't have, and so, I mean, you can see my wall gets really big towards the.
No, it's just the cross piece.
Yeah,
And,
so that's.
and when you have an intersection, it all depends on, like what Scott's saying is you're coming in, the drawing he has there. If this was across the street from you on, was it 3725? That other road goes down.
Yep.
So that lot right there, you could, in theory, say, well, we're gonna take 2 feet off, 2 foot of height off the 3725 measurement. And see, but not be so concerned about 2 feet of height on the 575.
Yeah.
But it's only for eastbound traffic, all of a sudden now westbound.
Yeah, I
And,
guess-
and so like your place, if you're coming down the hill where you're at, looking to the right, well, oncoming traffic is across the street. It's not, right at you. So
Yeah,
it changes the.
My
scenery.
concern is the people across unless they have decided, well, I don't know, it was in the planning, but they're wanting a pool on the south side. And I'm like, oh, good heavens, how is that gonna, this whole thing, I don't know how they're gonna do it, but. Hats off to them. Anyway, so I just try to think.
That's a whole other
And
thing.
there's,
Yeah,
there's like the vertical 2 foot measurement, and then there's the fixed or static, like horizontal 2 foot measurement, right?
yep,
And
okay,
so this one, something could actually potentially get taller at a certain point, and it's case by case. We really don't, we enforce this in fences, because fences they're going to be there, they're gonna be fixed. And the only cases I've ever seen where we've gone in and asked for vegetation removed is when there's been a known conflict area. So it's like right-hand turns onto a high-speed corridor from a blind corner, and we've had rear end happen there. In those cases, code enforcement has gone out and we've either trimmed bushes for property owners who may not have financial means to do it, or we have asked for or removed vegetation in those cases. Otherwise, it's a standard that it's there for liability protection and other, things for you as a property owner really too. But it's not one that we end up enforcing it.
So at the bottom of 1050 East, are you familiar with that road?
yes,
And 2600, right across the street from Scott's house. The city has gone in that corner, that northeast corner. The city has gone in and trimmed those trees because that's a scenario. You're sitting down heading south on that, trying to look to the east to oncoming traffic, and the trees were growing out in that triangle so tall that you couldn't see cars. So they've trimmed. So that in that case, that's where, like what he's saying, is a real world example where we've done it.
There's still.
So many intersections where it's not.
Everyone's still too tall.
Yeah, but
In low speed residential intersections, it's typically less of an issue than if you're a north-south entering onto a Lowman View or Pleasant View Drive. In those cases, it's just a more serious matter. You've got speed differential there that would kill somebody as opposed to fender bender.
okay, yeah, I just, honestly, I was more of that whole, once you sign that in, I'm like, but I already brought pictures of
I still feel it's helpful, really. That's super helpful to see it.
Okay, cool, that was it.
any other comments? Anything online?
I propose we
Make a
close
motion
the
to close the public hearing.
second.
We got a motion and a second to close the public hearing. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right, discussion, recommendation.
To me, these cleanup items are like slam dunks, like I don't see any reason to oppose anything in there, and the side triangle was beat up in here extensively.
Yeah. Yeah, we've already,
So I'm comfortable moving forward without much discussion.
Okay.
Myself,
is that a motion?
that is a motion
Was that a motion?
It isn't gonna be. We can always discuss my motion, so I move that we recommend positive, we give positive recommendation to the city council for item ZTA 2022-10.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Commissioner Lunt,
Yes.
Commissioner Barker,
Yes.
Commissioner Webb,
Yes.
Commissioner Mason,
Yes.
and I vote yes. All right. Now we'll open up for public comments. If there's anything you'd like to address the planning commission with, please do so at this time.
Wasn't really, I don't know if John looks at his email during this, but I did send him a picture in his email, but just to show,
Please get your name one more time for the.
oh, sorry, Chris Bulver, you want the address?
I don't think we need that.
You don't want to third time. But anyway, I sent a picture of what the holiday lights will look like, and so you won't even think about that wall after that. So, the wall goes right directly behind the trees back there, so.
Just leave it year round.
What's that?
Just leave it calling.
Well, now you've changed the traffic pattern in your neighborhood to a high use road in December, so. Now we may have to force a different,
And the white wants more lights, so don't ask me.
Thank you. Any other public comments? All right, remarks from planning commission,
oh, I've been waiting for this.
aside from painting roads.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, just kidding. Just kidding.
Furious. That the road striping in North Ogden was not marked, and I drove my new pickup through that yellow paint, and I know it happened to me, it happened to other people. I'd love you guys to see my,
My wife's got white paint down the side of her car.
was it marked?
I don't know. I didn't ask her. I just, it
I
was after I saw yours. I'm like, well, it's not that bad.
I did read on one of the things that maybe like Vaseline, leave it on, might actually cause it to pop off.
well,
I know. Hopefully they're working on it, because we did have one more person call and complain about the same incident.
yeah, I think we need to lean on that company because there was no way. So I turned to the left on Washington Boulevard. There was some traffic up ahead of me. They were all passing something to the left. I got into the center lane on Washington Boulevard to also pass on the left. And by that time, I had driven through a couple hundred yards of yellow paint, and it splattered all over my pickup. And that company tried telling me that they were trying to flag me down or something, and there is no way. And I have evidence. I have a testimonial from someone who witnessed it, that there was no cones or anything. So
And you said they were shooting white paint.
they were shooting white paint out the right of their paint truck, and I passed them to the left like the other cars were doing. I didn't know it was a paint truck at this point because there's Suburbans and stuff in front of me. They got to be more careful with that. That's that was like 9 o'clock in the morning, Washington Boulevard, and
Well, they learned because later that day they were putting cones out on their lights.
They're gonna
Your
learn.
brand new truck turned yellow.
So, yeah. Anyway, thank you. Oh, you've not heard the end of this.
That would be annoying.
Oh, you've not heard the end of this.
The company hasn't heard the end of it either, I'm sure.
Any other comments? Scott, anything from you?
Tomorrow and Friday is the Utah APA conference, and I neglected to invite you guys to the local APA conference, so I apologize for that. We do have budget available if you find yourself available on, tomorrow or Friday. You want to go down to Thanksgiving Point. Otherwise, we'll have the spring conference, which we have. There's, I'll have to double check the budget if there's out of state or out of area budget for all the commissioners, but it seems like we have a pretty decent planning commission budget for Utah APA. Another option is,
Where's the Utah APA?
so at Thanksgiving Point for
Tomorrow on Friday.
Tomorrow and Friday, yeah.
I've attended that in the fall in the past and found it pretty helpful.
Yeah, it's
I was
really,
down in Salt Lake at the time.
yeah, it's really good. So Brandon, Kai, and myself will be there. I'm presenting in 2 sessions about legislative items. And then come springtime, it's typically March or April, southern Utah somewhere, so it's warm and we can look at that as well. There's also Utah League of Cities and Towns. That conference over, Brandon? So there's
No.
so there's ULCT conference coming up. That's another one that we could potentially shift some of our budget over if you were interested in attending. That one's geared a little bit more towards policymakers, so really planning commission and city council members as well as elected officials. Or the Utah Land Use Institute, if you're real interested in land use law, is an excellent one to go to, and that you're all in the recommending policymaker space. So it's, you know, we have a few training opportunities coming up. Those would all count for your planning commission training, which is also something that we'll need to focus on between now and the end of the year, just to get a couple more hours of planning commissioner training.
Let's see, I think the only person that wasn't here was Johnson, but the most beneficial training I've had since I've been on the planning commission for like 6 years or 5 years or whatever was the time in Moab when we had the conference, and then we had the individual session where we got to interact a little more informally with
Meg.
Meg Ryan, that's right, not the celebrity. But I found that super, super beneficial, and just would encourage people if there's a possibility for that, that would be great.
The ULCT conference does have a date specific to planning. So that's also one thing to consider.
But what I know, but I'm also suggesting that if we were to do something like that, like if we're in southern Utah and you go, we budget some time in the evening or something for additional training, make the most of the month of the time and get something like that we had with Meg Ryan, and I thought that was great. That's just a suggestion.
I was just gonna say that there is a provision that if you attend enough of these meetings and you get an extra hour of training. My guess is most of you have probably met that.
Yeah.
But so that helps, but we still just have to make sure we
Yeah, I
check the
think
box
we're
by the end of it.
Yeah,
But the spring would be
additional
for
hours.
next year though.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. John, anything from you?
Nothing extra other than, we are doing a lot of things in the city to try and shift how far we're looking forward. So we, Brandon and Scott have been spending a lot of time on how to make sure that you all get involved in that discussion on how we grow. Because in theory, if you look at the numbers, we're supposed to be built out in like 15 years. That's not a long time.
Well, speaking of that, I filled out the information on that Scott had sent me for
the
regional transportation plan. Is there any results of that, or
So that.
when is the timeline of
Yeah,
that?
it's a 4-year process. So we're like a snippet in time right now. So I followed back up with WFRC staff on comments that were put on that plan. So thank you for putting comments. I had a few specific ones. There's a crossing over here at Pleasant View Drive and Washington Boulevard that has potential to be closed, and that's a major school crossing right there at just where we've limited the left-hand turn, basically. And then there were some comments and questions about Monroe Boulevard and Mountain Road that were in there, and I've addressed those with them. So you'll see they're the draft phased needs, they're phasing of the plan. So what they do is they phase from a needs standpoint, which means this is when we think we want this or when we think the growth will come in. And then they take all the money that they expect to get from state, federal, and local resources and put a fiscally constrained needs list together. Usually what happens for communities like North Ogden, where we don't have a front runner, we don't have I-15 access, and we're kind of shoulder cities as far as growth goes, is that it often bumps our projects up the list. That the money from a fiscally constrained standpoint ends up in the high growth, missing connectivity areas and some of those shoulder areas, just kind of.
Like, do you know where, I had thought at one time we were fairly close on getting funding for Mountain Road to connect from Pleasant View to 450 East.
Yeah, so
And
I haven't
Pleasant View was
seen
supposed
whether-
to get
but-
their funding to build it.
and
And
it seems like that's a phase 2, so that's at least 10 years out, but between 10 and 20. So the WFRC's long range plan is 30 years and it's in 3 chunks of 10-year timeframes. So phase 1 is the next 10 years. And then it seems like that's a phase 2 project, which for phase 2 projects, that seems really far away. But as far as the planning goes, from like an engineering standpoint or starting to apply for money, that's just a few years away from starting to apply. Because if you get one of those TIP grants or state transportation improvement program monies, like what built Washington Boulevard, they applied for that 6 years before they built it. So you gotta be thinking way ahead. In fact, I worked at WFRC and I met with Lauren and Dave and Mayor Taylor at the time, and John was probably out there. And we were standing on this, 2-lane road with a center cross section. I remember standing there at the church and thinking, this road's gonna be awful close to that white house, and turns out it sure was. And we ended up finding that house and tearing it down. But those are 6-year out funds. So if you're a phase 2 project and you're a today WFRC plan, you're within 3 or 4 years from beginning to apply for those dollars. So we could see that road, that connection go in sooner than later.
Do you know where Pleasant View stands on? Because they got funding to acquire right away. As far as construction is
It seemed
concerned?
like they had a project that was going in that was going to impact the east-west connection on that roadway, and I don't know where that stands.
They've got to request it to WACOG for $15 million
Okay.
to do that right of way across the top. And I think your original budget was 6. So it's pretty substantial. I don't know how likely they are to get, because that's most of the WACOG's funding for years.
And we don't have any, at least as far as I know, and in speaking to Public Works, none of our major roadways, so Monroe or Mountain Road, we're really actively approaching the regional sources of funding for, because you have development potential surrounding each side of these pieces of roadway. So we're kind of in a wait and see. When development comes in, we're picking up Mountain Road in 100 or 1,000 foot sections of it at a time.
Okay,
Thank you for commenting. I appreciate that.
anything else, John? All right, item 12.
I motion we adjourn.
Yeah,
Second.
motion and a second to adjourn, all in favor?